Well, as we've reported, officials in Baltimore have ruled that Freddie Gray's death was a homicide based on the evidence collected and the autopsy report. Joining us now is forensic scientist Dr. Lawrence Kobilinsky to discuss the findings of the autopsy. He's from John Jay College here. Thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
You've looked at a lot of autopsy reports. If you were looking at this autopsy report, obviously we haven't seen it, but what do you think you would be looking for?
Well, in particular, I would like to know what sort of trauma is apparent from the x-rays or the examination of the 3 cervical vertebrae that we keep hearing have been fractured. We have to know more about what kind of fracture occurred. Is it a compression fracture? Are these vertebrae fractured on the sides or in the front or the back? That will help us understand a little bit more about the mechanism as to how this happened, because the severance of the cord followed the fracture of the vertebrae. We just don't have that mechanism. Now, in an autopsy report, we're going to hear from the medical examiner. We're going to hear about the cause of death and the manner of death, which is exactly what medical examiners do. But the mechanism in this particular case is of great significance. That's what I'm waiting for.
And remind our audience again, when you say the three cervical vertebrae,
right,
where you're talking about.
Yeah, the cervical vertebrae are the uppermost vertebrae in the neck. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. There are 2 that are a little different from all the rest. The 2 hold the head up. The first holds the head up, the atlas and the axis. The axis allows the head to rotate, not like an owl, but to a certain extent. You can rotate your head. Exactly. And below that are the 5 other cervical vertebrae. And again, we don't even know which vertebrae are fractured, but we have heard that there are 3 that have been fractured.
Is it likely that a defense attorney, Dr. Z, would argue, or Dr. K, would argue that maybe the person in question here did it to themselves? Is it possible to sustain that kind of injury and do it on your own?
It's possible that a defense attorney would take that route. I think it is fruitless because, in my opinion, and in the opinion of others that I have spoken to, you cannot generate enough force to smack your head into a wall and break your neck.
Right. People were talking about him potentially banging his head on the wall, but can you do it?
You can certainly bang your head on the wall, even if you're in handcuffs and you're shackled, but it's not going to break your neck. I think that you need tremendous force. You need it focused in the area of those 3 vertebrae. That's a serious fracture. People fracture their necks, they will break 1 vertebrae. You've got 3 vertebrae that are fractured, and the cord, what we're hearing, about 80% severed. That's significant trauma, cataclysmic trauma.
So for those of us who are not medical professionals such as yourself, how do you come to the conclusion as a pathologist or an ME that it's a homicide?
So let me say, in terms of the cause of death, it's pretty clear that when you sever a spinal cord, even if it's incomplete, if there's some of the cord that remains intact, there's going to be respiratory and cardiac problems. And presumably the cause of death is respiratory failure secondary to the severing of the cord. That's cause of death. That's a medical explanation for what happened that caused his death. However, the manner of death falls into 5 categories. Things like accident, suicide, homicide, natural causes, or indeterminate. I think the critical question here is, why did the medical examiner say homicide as opposed to indeterminate? Indeterminate means we don't know. So there's got to be some evidence that has resulted in a call of homicide. Now, what is homicide? It's not murder. It's not negligent homicide, negligent murder. It is simply the death of an individual by the hand of another. And that's the category. Now, as far as charges go, that's up to the district attorney or the state's attorney in this case. And apparently, she thinks she has enough information to charge murder too, which is depraved, and there's an argument of intent. There's intent to kill. That's a pretty heavy charge. And I think it's questionable whether she'll be able to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt.
So if you were looking at something and trying to decide if it's homicide, you'd be asking yourself potentially who put him in that position, and you know who was driving, what happened during the ride.
Well, here's the issue. I mean, you're talking about a prisoner. He was arrested, perhaps illegally, but he was arrested. He was in custody. The police have an absolute responsibility to protect a prisoner in custody. So you could argue, well, they didn't call EMS when he asked for help. He asked for medical help several times along this process, and they didn't seatbelt him in the van. Again, these are dangerous decisions. So certainly, I mean, the police were, I'm going to use the word negligent in not safeguarding him.
Dr. Kobilinsky, one final question. Going back to the manner of death in the sense of being a homicide, is it just the broken neck that determines we think it's a homicide, or is it everything leading up to it, like he wasn't given this, he wasn't buckled in?
Well, you know, this is not the first case where somebody was not buckled in, put in a police vehicle and given a rough ride, and then succumbed due to a severed spinal cord.
Right.
This happened to a fellow named Don D. Johnson, and Baltimore paid a heavy price for that civil case. So, I mean, it can happen that way. I mean, this is a murder two case. The allegation is something happened in the van, whether it was a rough ride or they picked up this poor Gray and threw him into the back of the van. There's some evidence we're hearing that there is an injury to the head, apparently because he hit a bolt of some sort. Again, we don't have all this information without the autopsy report. But if somebody picked him up and threw him in and he hit that bolt, and as a result he broke his neck, that is a murder.
And it would be fair to say, in your view, that the autopsy report, whatever it says, had to be a key part in the decision here to charge.
There's no question about it. Remember, I think many people knew this would be called a homicide. But what the mechanism is, who was really responsible, when did it happen? Did it really all happen in the van? Did it happen upon the arrest and the struggle, the tackle that brought him down? These are still questions maybe the autopsy will tell us. We don't know for sure.
Dr. Kobilinsky, thank you for being here.
Sure, pleasure.
Thank you very much.